Hello, gamers. My name is Ryan Overturf, and I would like to welcome you to the first episode of my new Cube podcast, 180 MTG. The name, of course, is a reference to the number of cards in my Tubert Cubes, 180 cards, but much like my old podcast, the 540, this podcast will be dealing with all things Cube of all shapes and sizes, starting today with my first episode being a Cube review, early impressions of the new Magic release, Edge of Eternities. First things first, I'm going to go over my approach to set reviews here on the new podcast. What I'm going to do is go over the mechanics in the set, highlighting some individual cards that feature the new mechanics, and then segueing to just some individual card designs that I see as standouts for Cube. When it comes to new set releases these days, they often are partnered with a companion Commander product. Edge of Eternities is no exception. There are 2 Commander decks, and sometimes the Commander release is really meaty. There's a lot to talk about. When it comes to sets like Final Fantasy, Modern Horizons, that is very much the case. With Edge of Eternities, there's not a ton going on in the Commander decks. They're using the same mechanics. There are a couple individual cards I want to highlight, but it's not really worth a huge deep dive into those decks. So I'm just going to be talking about those individual cards on today's episode, and I will be calling out when I am talking about a Commander card, so you'll know when those come up. So without further ado, let's get down to my Cube review of Edge of Eternities. The first and loudest mechanic in Edge of Eternities is going to be Station. Station is a keyword that you'll find on a handful of artifacts with the type Spacecraft, or lands with the type Planet. And the Station ability reads, tap another creature you control. Put charge counters equal to its power on this card, be it a planet or a spacecraft. Station only as a sorcery. And they all have some threshold of charge counters on them. Take, for example, Susur Secundi, Void Altar. This is the black planet land in the cycle, so it enters tapped, and it taps for black. And then once it gets 12 charge counters, presumably by stationing, it gains the ability 1 and a black, and tap, and pay 2 life, and sacrifice a creature. Draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power, activate only as a sorcery. So right off the bat, you can see that threshold is really high, 12 plus counters. That's going to be a lot of tapping creatures. Notably, you can only station at sorcery speed. So there's really steep investment here. And with the cycle of planets, there's 1 for every color. They're attached to a land that enters tapped. So these aren't going to fit into a lot of cubes, certainly not higher power cubes. At a glance, these look largely like they're cards for a commander. And that's true for a lot of these spaceships too. There are some of these artifacts that have good enter the battlefield abilities, and those are generally going to be the standouts. Some of them have lower thresholds to station them into creatures or to gain some meaningful ability, but for the most part, there's only a couple standouts, and this is going to be a mechanic that's going to fit only into lower powered cubes, or maybe cubes specifically going for the space aesthetic, which is very much gaining a lot from Edge of Eternities. The standout spacecraft for me actually does come from the Commander decks in the form of Uthros Research Craft, which is a spacecraft for 2 and a blue. Does nothing when it enters, just has no text other than station. And then when it has 3 or more charge counters, it gains whenever you cast an artifact spell, draw a card, and put a charge counter on this spacecraft. And then when it has 12 or more charge counters, it becomes a 0/8 creature with flying, and it gets +1/+0 for each artifact you control. Now this is a very specific card, but notably it does something very different from a lot of the other spacecrafts. It's cheap to cast. It's just 3 mana. There's some other stuff in this set that's a little bit on the cheaper side here, but the payoff here is well worth it. And the threshold to get it up to that whenever you cast an artifact, draw a card ability is very low. So this one here is a slam dunk for my artifact Tubert. You do need a very high threshold of artifacts to really pay off. Obviously the 3+ and the 12+ abilities really cue off of you having a lot of artifacts, but if you meet those requirements in your cube, I think that this card is quite strong, and there's some investment going on as well, so it plays in a way where there's a little bit of a game to it. You know, it's not that hard to get it up to 3+, and then once you do, the value really does start rolling in, but there's windows for interaction. You have to have a little bit of setup before it starts going off, and you also have to have leftovers in the form of artifact spells to cast once you have it stationed to 3+. So it's a little niche, a little specific, but it is notably the only spacecraft card that I have actually acquired for any of my personal cubes. There are a few other spacecrafts that are worth discussing for one reason or another, though the one that I would be remiss if I did not mention here on the pod is Dawnspire Sunstar Dreadnought. This is a 5-mana legendary spacecraft. It does nothing when it enters, and then when you station it for 10 or more, whenever you attack, Dawnspire deals 100 damage to up to one target creature or planeswalker, and then when it's stationed for 20 or more, it becomes a 20/20 creature with flying. This is not a strong card. It is merely a card that inspires awe. Obviously, these big numbers are put on the card so that Timmies and Tammies can see the large numbers and just be happy about that. And I'm not too proud to admit that those numbers do spark some joy in me. So this is a card that I hope to put in a cube at some point in time. It's really difficult to do in any cube that has any reasonable amount of artifact destruction or cards that can enter a 5-mana do-nothing, which, let's be real, that's going to be a lot of cubes in the year 2025. But this one very much goes on my someday, my cube bucket list. I hope to play with this card at some point. Ultimately, Station is a mechanic that I think there's more to say about aesthetically than mechanically, but the next mechanic in Edge of Eternities is a doozy, and that's going to be Warp. Warp is a mechanic that shows up on creatures that allows you to cast them for a discount, but then exiles them at the end step, but then later you can cast them from exile just for their regular casting cost. So to give you the exact verbiage, Warp reads, you may cast this card from your hand for its warp cost, exile this creature at the beginning of the next end step, then you may cast it from exile on a later turn. This mechanic is very similar to Adventure, where it allows you to cast a creature a little bit ahead of schedule for some ability. Generally, cards with Warp, a lot of them have just some kind of static ability on the battlefield, so casting them for their Warp cost lets you access their ability before you could actually pay full retail for the creature. And then there's not really much in the way of a penalty, because then at the end of the turn it's exiled and you could just cast them later for their regular cost. There's no penalty for it. So Warp is just a really powerful ability. It lets you leverage your mana efficiently on early turns. Let's take a look at some cards with Warp and just get a feel for how they play. The first on my list to discuss is Susarian Voidborn, which is 2 and a black for a 2/2 vampire soldier. It reads, whenever this creature or another creature or artifact you control dies, target opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life, and it has Warp for just 1 black mana. So you can get this Blood Artist kind of effect in play for just 1 mana. Maybe you want to get this effect out before making some kind of attack and get these drain life triggers off of attacking with some sticky creatures, just something like that. But you don't necessarily want to spend the 3 mana, or maybe you're missing your 3rd land drop. There's a lot of reasons you might warp this. In particular, this card fits really well into sacrifice decks, so just warping it for 1, maybe in just one big kind of combo-y turn that involves sacrificing this, and that way you were only paying 1 for a Blood Artist effect, which is typically something you have to pay 2 or more mana for. This card is really strong. This one is going to make it into my Spooky Cube and my Peasant Tubert. Any kind of cube that has that kind of sacrifice synergy deck, this card fits into really effectively. Vampire and Soldier also are very meaningful creature types, so I expect this to be one of the more cubed cards from Edge of Eternities. Next up is All Fates Stalker. This is 3 and a white for a 2/3 Drix Assassin creature. When All Fates Stalker enters, exile up to 1 target non-assassin creature until this creature leaves the battlefield, and you can warp it for 1 and a white. So it says non-assassin, so it can't just blink itself and cause the game to be a draw in that way. But then these abilities, warping it versus casting it, does 2 potentially different things. This is sort of a Fiend Hunter kind of card. It's just a creature that can remove one of your opponent's creatures from the battlefield until they can answer your All Fates Stalker. Or, when you warp it, notably, you can use that to just blink one of your own creatures. Maybe you have some other Enter's ability that you want another shot at. You can also just warp it for 1 and a white to remove a blocker for 1 turn, and then because of the way Warp works, you just have the 4 mana Owl Fate Stalker later to Fiend Hunter something else. And that modality, removing a blocker or blinking your own thing, it's really powerful, except you're not actually choosing one or the other because of Warp. You just get to do both, right? You warp it early, blink something, remove a blocker, or whatever you want to do, and then you just get to cast the actual card later. Sure, it costs 4 mana. Any other Fiend Hunter, you can get this on 3 mana creatures. Oftentimes we get stuff that in this space that even has flash for 3 mana, but the way that this kind of does multiple things, this card is quite powerful. For my personal cubes, it's going to fit into my Peasant Tubert, but I can see realistically putting this in higher powered cubes as well, especially if you have some kind of blink theme. I do think that this card is quite powerful. Another very powerful creature with Warp that is quite a lot more specific is going to be Pinnacle Emissary. This is a 3/3 artifact creature robot for 1, a blue, and a red. It can warp for a blue-red hybrid mana, and it reads, whenever you cast an artifact spell, create a 1/1 colorless drone artifact creature token with flying, and that token this token can block only creatures with flying. So the tokens here, the fact that they can only block flyers, there is some lower power there than what you see in a lot of tokens. They're evasive, sure, but they're much better at attacking than blocking. Oftentimes the power of tokens does come from their ability to block and just go wide on the battlefield. That is one of the benefits of going wide, is being able to block very effectively. But just the rate here, if you have a lot of 1 and certainly 0 mana artifacts in your cube, the payoff here is quite strong. I don't think this is necessarily the kind of thing that can hang on something like Vintage Cube. Certainly being a blue-red gold card, there's a pretty significant list of stronger is-it cards when we're talking about actually playing with power. But if your cube is really heavy on artifacts, certainly if you're supporting any kind of artifact aggro deck, if you're in the market for Arcbound Ravager, I think that this card is going to be quite strong in your cube. This is a slam dunk for my artifact Tubert. Next up is arguably my favorite card from Edge of Eternities. That's going to be Timeline Color. It's a 2/2 Drix Warlock for black with haste, and you may cast this card from your graveyard using its warp ability, and it warps for 1 black mana and the cost of 2 life. So very similar to Bloodghast, a creature you can actually cast from your graveyard that can trigger some other stuff that cares about you casting spells from your graveyard. The automatic haste, the fact that this creature can block, there's a lot to like here. You know, the black casting cost, that's a little bit tough, but there's so many ways to just take advantage of putting this card into your graveyard, warping it, getting in some chip shots that way. This is a home run for Spooky Cube. Of course, it fits into the Madness deck. Any deck that's trying to hybridize sacrifice themes with Madness. You know, a creature that you can cast out of your graveyard is quite strong in a sacrifice deck as well. A 2/2 haste for 2 mana. In higher powered cubes, this is not really able to hang as well as it used to, 5 or more years ago. But this card is very charming. It's reminiscent of things I really enjoy in cube. And I think it does fit really well into graveyard synergy cubes, which is a space that I really enjoy playing in. And the last card with the warp that I wanted to discuss is Nova Hellkite. Nova Hellkite is a 4/5 flying hasty dragon for 3 red, and it has, when this creature enters, it deals 1 damage to target creature an opponent controls, and you can warp it for 2 and a red. So that haste, that's very significant. When you warp this for 3 mana, you just get to attack with your 4/5, potentially doing 1 damage and killing an opposing creature with that. This card is really good at cutting down planeswalkers. There's give and take relative to other 5-mana dragons. My favorite 5-mana dragons tend to be Glorybringer and Thundermaw Hellkite. Those also have some removal abilities. Thundermaw Hellkite also has that very important 5th power. But Warp on Nova Hellkite is just really strong. Being able to get in that 4 points for just 3 mana, and then just having access to the 5-mana 4/5 flying haste dragon. It doesn't cost you that to do it. The play patterns on this can also be pretty sneaky and powerful, where if you think your opponent has a removal spell, even when you have 5 mana, maybe you just warp the Nova Hellkite when they're tapped out so you can get a hit in, and you can leverage the rest of your mana in some other way. Maybe you play around a sweeper doing this. There's quite a lot to like with this card. I haven't slotted it into the original recipe tuber just yet, but the more I think about it, the more I do think it's ultimately going to find a home there. Honestly, with how good it is at attacking down planeswalkers, it's possible that this card ends up being too strong for that environment, but it's a really rad card and very much worthy of cube inclusion. And that is going to bring us to Void. Void is an ability word introduced in Edge of Eternities that gives cards some additional ability if a non-land permanent left the battlefield this turn, or if a spell was warped this turn. There's not a lot going on here. Generally, I do not like Void on my cards for two reasons. It's just kind of a weaker revolt. That's the first reason. Lands leaving the battlefield tends to be a lot of the incentive to do something with revolt. So these cards can sometimes take a second to read, oh, non-land, this doesn't work with fetch lands, this is not actually very powerful. And then the other reason is that it specifically calls out warp. There's just not that many cards with warp, and it's just the kind of thing where there's extra complexity, extra words on the cards. It's not very desirable for me to have that kind of thing in my cubes. And really, there's just not a lot of cards with void text that are worth discussing. In fact, there's only one real standout for me, and that's going to be Elegy Acolyte, which is a 4-mana 4/4 human cleric for 2 black. It has lifelink. Whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, you draw a card and lose 1 life. And then the void text at the beginning of your end step, if a non-land permanent left the battlefield this turn or a spell was warped this turn, you create a 2/2 colorless robot artifact creature token. This is just kind of a nice top end for a sacrifice deck. Decks that have cards like Timeline Color, just creatures that are happy to attack, that are going to come out of the graveyard, maybe generate value in some other way, stuff that triggers off of die triggers otherwise, and just making those chump attacks, getting in some point somewhere, being able to draw a card and lose a life, and then also likely making that 2/2 robot for your trouble as well, all on a 4-mana 4/4. It's also a human. That's a creature type that very much matters in Spooky Cube. That's where I am putting this card. I do like this card quite a bit in any kind of cube that has some kind of a sacrifice theme going. Being a mono black card makes it easier to find space for this than a lot of other stuff. It's also nice that it's like a reasonably sized creature that generates value turn over turn and doesn't just end the game. So the power level, it is strong, but it is also in some ways modest, which I find very charming. Elegy Acolyte just hits all of the notes of what I am looking for in a curve topper for a cube with a low mana curve. And that brings us to Lander tokens. Lander tokens are artifacts that have 2 mana tap, sacrifice this token, search your library for a basic land card and put it on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. So essentially, Lander tokens are just a rampant growth that sits on the battlefield until you pay their cost. We have seen a lot of named artifact tokens to this point. Treasures, clues, food, those are kind of the big ones. We see blood, maps. I think Lander is going to be closer to blood or a map than it is to something like a treasure, where we see this rarely if ever. And I kind of think that Lander, that name, it feels very specific to the aesthetic of Edge of Eternities, right? There's something that feels very spacey about Lander. It doesn't seem like the kind of thing you would just come across everywhere like you would treasure or food, which feel very evergreen. And there's not a ton of Lander stuff in Edge of Eternities. Just a couple cards really worth talking about. The standout from the main set is going to be Litho Breaking, which is an instant for 2 and a red. It creates a Lander token, then you may sacrifice an artifact, and when you do, Litho Breaking deals 2 damage to each creature. So if you just have no artifacts, essentially this is a 2 and a red instant that deals 2 damage to every creature, right? You make the Lander and immediately sacrifice it. Or then there's synergies if you just have some other artifacts, particularly stuff that you were happy to sacrifice, Ichor Wellspring being the classic example, just an artifact that enters and draws a card, and also draws a card when it goes to the graveyard. So this is the kind of thing that can show up in artifact-based cubes, even just cubes with like a kind of a modest value artifact theme, or you can just play this in instant speed sweeper, just kind of ignore what's going on with the lander token. Maybe now and again somebody will pay 3, make the lander, and then just use the rampant growth. It could come up. It's not efficient, it's not strong, but it is an option. This is mostly going to be something for lower powered cubes, but it is a cool design and I wanted to shout it out. The most significant card that creates lander tokens actually comes from the Commander precons, and that's going to be Horizon Explorer. Horizon Explorer is a 3-mana insect scout for 2 and a green. It is a 2/4 that reads lands you control enter untapped, and whenever you attack a player, create a lander token. So in effect, with your lands entering untapped and making lander tokens potentially every turn whenever you attack a player, it kind of only costs 1 to sacrifice your lander tokens, right? Because they go and find a basic and it now enters untapped. 3-mana 2/4, it's not breaking any records these days, but this is a significant body for 3 mana. And what I like about this card is it just immediately takes my brain to a space of thinking about casting step links. That is, I really like the idea of putting this creature into an aggressive landfall deck. Oftentimes, when you start going down the road of landfall in cube, you start looking at cards like Lotus Cobra, Tireless Tracker, and it does just become this mana and stuff package where it's all about just having more mana than your opponent. The aggressive creatures don't fit into the good landfall decks, and Horizon Explorer is a design that kind of lets you play more in the space of wanting to attack, right? You only get the lander tokens if you're attacking, and notably, your Horizon Explorer, it wants to show up on curve after you cast a 1 and or a 2 mana creature. You want to attack the turn you cast the Horizon Explorer because it just cares when you attack a player, not when it itself attacks. I haven't really looked at where I would want to fit this into a cube of my own, but it is a card that does stand out as something that I want to explore personally someday. Specifically, Step Links, as I mentioned, that's on my list of cards that I want to be cubing with again. It's just not that strong of a card. You know, it's anything that's singularly focused on just attacking means that there's just not that much play to it. There's many more powerful options these days. But coming up with synergistic packages can make cards like that more worth exploring, and that space does excite me. So I am a fan of Horizon Explorer for that reason. And that's going to do it for new mechanics from Edge of Eternities. Now I want to take a little bit of time to talk about some specific cards from the set. The first is going to be Lightstall Inquisitor. The reason that I want to talk about this card is because I don't believe that it's nearly as powerful as it looks. So let's start with the stat lines here. Lightstall Inquisitor is a 1-drop for 1 white mana. You get a 2/1 Angel Wizard with Vigilance, and when this creature enters, each opponent exiles a card from their hand and may play that card for as long as it remains exiled. Each spell cast this way costs 1 more to cast. Each land played this way enters the battlefield tapped. So this is a card that I think looks much more powerful than Savannah Lions, and if you ever had the choice between the two, of course you would play Lightstall Inquisitor, not Savannah Lions. But the reason that I want to draw this comparison is I don't believe that I would ever play Lightstall Inquisitor in a deck that wouldn't play Savannah Lions. You are signing up for 1 mana 2/1. If that's what you want, great. And a lot of aggressive decks are happy with that, even with the drawback. You get some upside here, but I want to point out that the upside here is not that significant. Vigilance is just kind of free. You're putting it on a 1 toughness creature, right? What's the situation where Vigilance on your Savannah Lions actually really matters? Your opponent has a 1 or 2 toughness creature that they want to attack with, that they don't want to trade in combat. So your opponent controls Ragavan? Doesn't Ragavan already have a pretty bad matchup against any creature with any amount of power? It's just meaningfully not showing up in a lot of games. And then the ability to tax an opponent's card in hand, it's fine. If they already just have a land that enters tapped in their hand, though, then it does nothing. You know, the land enters tapped, doesn't do anything additionally. they get to choose. So some spell maybe costs one more mana. Maybe there's some spell that just doesn't fit in their curve well. Maybe they don't have it play on turn one anyway, and they just play their lands tapped, and it doesn't make any difference whatsoever. This card can be strong in some contexts. I think that the situation where Lightstall Inquisitor actually becomes very real is if you are breaking Singleton. Maybe your cube has 3, maybe it has 5 Lightstall Inquisitors. You know, if you're casting 1 on turn 1 and 2 on turn 2, suddenly, whoa, maybe your opponent's in a lot of trouble, right? They're taken completely off balance, their lands are entering tapped, all their spells cost extra mana. This card can really do some damage in multiples. There's just not a lot going on with one copy. You know, it's like fine to blink. Sometimes it'll overperform, but mostly I stand by my statement. If you think your deck is too good for Savannah Lions, it is unlikely that Lightstall Inquisitor should make your deck either. And to be clear, I don't think the card is super weak or anything. I think that Savannah Lions is actually just reasonably powerful. It's just, I think it's meaningful to call out that this card is not as much better than Savannah Lions as it may appear. This is very reminiscent of Usher of the Fallen and more recently Descendant of Storms for me, where these cards look like significant upgrades to something maybe you wanted to do anyway, where it turns out actually in games, certainly in singleton environments when it comes to Lightstall Inquisitor, these cards amount to about what you would get out of Savannah Lions anyway. Alright, next up is Umbral Collar Zealot. This is a card that I like quite a lot. It is a human cleric for 1 and a black. It is a 3/2 that reads sacrifice another creature or artifact, surveil 1. Viscera Seer is a card that I have wanted in some cubes over the last however many years, and just 1 mana 1/1 is such a bad stat line. 2 mana 3/2, this is a card that just plays in regular games of Magic. You can just be attacking your opponent, getting no synergy from this card otherwise, and it just looks really nice on the mana curve. Then when you get into sacrifice synergies, you start sacrificing things for meaningful value. You get to Surveil, which tends to put cards into your graveyard, which sacrifice decks tend to have a number of creatures that you can cast out of your graveyard or ways to take advantage of cards in your graveyard some other way. Not to mention that just surveilling can smooth out your draws and help you manage to navigate the game that way. Card's also a human and a cleric, human being the very relevant creature type for me. I think that being a mono black 2-drop with these stats makes Umbral Collar Zealot just a slam dunk for basically any cube with a sacrifice theme. This one's going into my spooky cube, of course, both for the human creature type and the sacrifice synergies, and it's going to go into my peasant Tubert as well, where it's just a really nice sacrifice outlet with a stat line that can actually hang with other creatures, unlike Viscera Seer. If you really care about the efficiency, 2 mana is more than 1, but if you ever intend to play a normal game of Magic where maybe all of your synergies aren't humming and you are just attacking for damage, Umbral Collar Zealot is excellent at doing that. Next up is Frenzied Baloth. This is a 2 mana green creature for green. You get a 3/2 beast. This spell can't be countered. It has trample and haste. Creature spells you control can't be countered, and combat damage can't be prevented. I have always had a soft spot for green aggro decks. I think that once you start going into the mana dork space and casting stuff ahead of schedule, it's really just about generically casting the most powerful spells. So anything that can give green an identity that's not mana ramp, I tend to enjoy green more when it's playing in these spaces. Green is certainly about large monsters, at least efficient monsters, and attacking and blocking in my Tempo Tubert. That's where I will be slotting in Frenzied Baloth. It does some pretty cool things in that environment. There's some cheap counters like Spell Snare and Stern Scolding that is going to dodge and just fully insulate you against those. And what I really like about the card there is actually the damage can't be prevented, the combat damage can't be prevented line, because it's going to allow the green deck, just a green creature, to freely attack into Mother of Runes. right? Your Mother of Runes wielding opponent will no longer be able to bully you in combat if you control Frenzied Baloth, which is pretty cool. I don't expect this card to make a ton of cubes, but I have a home for it, and just the amount of things that this card does, despite not loving the double-pipped casting cost, I think that there is quite a lot to like about this card in the right environment. And the next card I want to discuss is the Endstone, which is a 7-mana legendary artifact. It reads, whenever you play a land or cast a spell, draw a card, and at the beginning of your end step, your life total becomes half your starting life total rounded up. Mostly, this is a vintage cube card. This is a card that you're pretty happy to tinker for. Notably, it is quite a lot weaker to tinker for than Bolas's Citadel. Drawing a card whenever you cast a spell or play a land is powerful, but you still have to spend mana to cast your spells, which I know that doesn't sound like that punishing a thing, but we're talking about a reference point of tinkering out Bolas's Citadel. That usually immediately converts into a game win. So this card is not as powerful to tinker out as Bolas's Citadel, but there's certainly merit to it, and if you're looking at something like the Magic Online Vintage Cube, a Vintage Cube with 540 cards, you take what you can get. This is on the short list of one of the better things you can tinker for, and notably, the area where this card outperforms Bolas's Citadel is in castability. The problem with Bolas's Citadel is sometimes you draw it, and black, like triple black in the casting cost, is really difficult for some decks to navigate. Certainly if you're majority or even mono blue. The Endstone just costing 7 generic mana makes it comparatively very easy to cast, and certainly if we're talking about powered cubes, Mishra's Workshop can cast it very effectively. This is a card that I imagine, even if when you have it in your Tinker deck, you win some number of the games pretty easily just by drawing it and playing your mana rocks and casting it. When you start looking at smaller, tighter vintage cubes, if you're like a 360 card vintage cube, which is where I tend to keep my paper vintage cube, then you start crowding a card like this out. You're going to want the Bolas's Citadel. I have a strong preference for having Blightsteel Colossus in the cube. It's a little tougher to justify the space, but it's the sort of thing where if you give this to a player who has Tinker and enough artifacts to play the Tinker, then they're probably happy to have this card in their deck. The question of whether it fits into the cube, that's another question entirely. But certainly if you're talking about a 540 card vintage cube, I think it's pretty easy to justify slotting this card in. And that brings us to the last card from the main set that I want to discuss, Tezzeret Cruel Captain, a colorless planeswalker. It's a 3-mana legendary Tezzeret that starts with 4 loyalty. Tezzeret has a static ability that reads, whenever an artifact you control enters, put a loyalty counter on Tezzeret. It has a 0 ability that reads, untap target artifact or creature. If it's an artifact creature, put a +1/+1 counter on it. It has a -3 ability that reads, search your library for an artifact card with mana value 1 or less, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. And a -7 that reads, you get an emblem with, at the beginning of combat on your turn, put 3 +1/+1 counters on target artifact you control. If it's not a creature, it becomes a 0/0 robot artifact creature. So there's 2 things that this Tezzeret really cares about, and I think if you're going to put this into a cube, you probably need to be checking both boxes. Those 2 things is that you want to have a high volume of cheap artifacts, cheap meaning 0 or 1 mana value. Realistically, you can also be making artifact tokens. The static ability does just give you loyalty for any artifact entering, but then you also want specific 1 and 0 mana artifacts that you can use the -3/4 to tutor up that will have a very significant impact on the game. The cards that come to mind, I'm thinking about Skull Clamp, I'm thinking about Retrofitter Foundry, like actual game enders. I think it's natural to think about Vintage Cube being a home for a card like this. Obviously, Moxen and Black Lotus, Soul Ring, these are cards you can tutor for, and they're quite strong. They're a little less strong if the walk you take to get there involves casting a 3-mana spell first, especially if all of it's doing is generating that value that one time. It's not that powerful. You're kind of just casting a 3-mana, like a Manolith at that point. So you kind of want to be doing everything that this card offers, but if you're doing that, I think there's something really strong here. I think generally Tezzeret is going to perform better in Constructed than in Cube, And a lot of that is it's a lot easier to build your deck in a way that really highlights a specific 1-mana artifact. Or if we're talking about like vintage constructed, then you have games where you tutor up Black Lotus, you have access to whatever 0 and 1s that you want, and you're going to have multiple really high impact -3s. You know, maybe in Modern, you're tutoring up Amulet of Vigor for your Primeval Titan decks. It's a little tougher to actually make this card really hum in Cube. I think that the texture of this card really fits into my artifact Tubert. The pre-order prices were pretty steep for me. I do see that the price of the card is in a little bit of a tailspin, but it's still like almost $30, which is more than I want to spend on it. You know, maybe it's not like 10. I'll pick it up. That's how invested I am in the artifact Tubert, I would say. And I think that mostly the card would be fine there. The issue is that the -7 is just all about attacking and blocking, which is a fine payoff, but when you have to get that much extra loyalty, and you're only getting that loyalty off of artifacts entering, right? There's no plus loyalty ability on Tezzeret, so you have to be making additional artifacts to get up to that -7, and then it is a really good ability for attacking and blocking. You pump out a ton of extra power and toughness every turn. You get 3 +1/+1 counters every turn, and you can even animate non-creature artifacts with it. That is significant. It's just a really specific card that I think texturally makes more sense and constructed than Cube, but there are going to be cubes that are happy to have this card. I think that my artifact Tubert is one of those. I just haven't experimented with it yet. So Tezzeret was the last card from the main set that I wanted to discuss today, but there's still a little bit more to go over from the Commander decks, and that's going to come in the form of the continuation of 2 land cycles. Notably, not the completion, just the continuation. We are seeing the continuation both of the tapped cycling 2-color dual lands and the Battle for Zendikar duels that enter untapped if you control 2 or more basic lands. You're getting the red-white and green-black entries for both of these cycles. So for the cycling duels, we have Festering Thicket being the green-black, the Swamp Forest, and Glittering Massif being the Mountain Plains. And then for the Battle for Zendikar-style lands, we have Radiant Summit being our red-white entry, and Vernal Fen being green-black. I'm personally very excited for the cycling duels. As a known hater of triomes, I like these lands a lot better for what they contribute to Cube, for the incentives that they provide. These lands are just quite nice in 2 and 3 color decks, whereas triomes tend to push you more in the direction of 4 and 5 colors. Cycling 2 also more appealing than cycling 3. I'm a pretty big fan of these lands. I'm less of a fan of the fact that we just now have 7. We've been told that they're going to continue rolling these out. I guess you do need the precon in the right colors. This is the way that you're going to do it. I'm a little impatient. We know that they're coming, so you certainly can just proxy the complete cycle. I intend to cube with these, and at least one cube. I have a cube these days that I curate. It's called the One Burt. That is a 180 card cube with all spells of mana value 1. I really like lands that enter tap there, so it's kind of like you are spending a mana on your land. And the cycling helps mitigate flooding when everything costs 1, so I like these lands a lot for that. I definitely plan to experiment with them in other cube environments as well. When it comes to the Battle for Zendikar lands, I personally don't really care about these lands at all. If they never completed this cycle, I wouldn't mind, but some people like them. So it is notable, and it is good that they are continuing and ultimately completing that cycle as well. But there's quite a bit less to report on for that. I think that the big thing that continuing the Battle for Zendikar cycle does is just that these are lands with types that can enter the battlefield untapped. So any cube is just looking for the threshold of that. Even if you're not specifically that interested in this text box, there's something to like there. I don't want to completely dog on them. They're generally not my scene, but there are appealing aspects of both of these cycles. And that is going to do it for my first impressions, my cube review of Edge of Eternities. For me, this is a set that offered some pretty significant goodies to both sacrifice decks and artifacts matter themes for cube. Those are really the big takeaways for me. Warp is a very powerful mechanic. The other mechanics in the set don't have a ton going on. There's some neat stuff with landfall, but mostly it's going to be sacrifice and artifacts matter themes. Edge of Eternities feels pretty standard as far as standard releases go these days. There's a good amount of goodies, the power level feels right, there's probably a handful of cards for everybody, but there's also a lot of stuff in the set that I don't necessarily expect to see again, a lot of stuff that I don't really have any intention of cubing with. On balance, though, it's a very cool release. Aesthetically, the set is awesome. I've been seeing a lot of people very excited about this set. I was not able to secure a last-minute spot at the pre-release. It was sold out, so clearly they are doing something right at the Wizard Factory. And Edge of Eternities is undeniably pretty cool. And that's going to be a wrap on episode 1 here on 180 MTG. My name is Ryan Overturf, and thank you so much for joining me today. And I am hoping to continue producing the podcast here on a weekly basis. So if you liked what you heard today, tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell total strangers. Like, subscribe, and all that jazz, and I'll see you next week.